Following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, blacks that had previously been slaves were granted freedom from slavery. Despite this new freedom, blacks were still put in a position of subservience to whites. In the American South, Jim Crow laws segregated whites and blacks. These laws prolonged the huge racial divide in these southern communities. Despite this great racial divide, many individuals fought for racial reform and equality. In 1954, a man named Oliver Brown sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas to end racial laws that segregated schools. Brown worked with lawyers from the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and others suing for the same reason. The suit resulted in a Supreme Court ban of the segregation of public schools, because separate education facilities are inherently unequal. This is a huge turning point in the fight for racial equality. In Little Rock, Arkansas, where 9 black students attended the Little Rock Central High School, conflict erupted when the governor of Arkansas called for the National Guard to prevent the 9 black students from entering the school. After major criticism, the students were finally able to go to school, but only with the help of the 101st Airborne Division escorting them through the school. The students received major harassments, but their actions paved the way for eventual complete desegregation of schools in the South. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus to make room for a white passenger. Parks was arrested and convicted of disorderly conduct. When black community members, many of whom were members of the NAACP alongside Parks, heard of Parks' arrest, they organized the Montgomery bus boycott. It was during the boycott that Martin Luther King Jr. got national recognition as a major player in the civil rights movement. The boycott was a huge success, and Montgomery lifted the ordinance that segregated the transportation system. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr., Charles K. Steele, and Fred L. Shuttlesworth established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and made King the first president. The SCLC was closely connected to the Southern Methodist Church. It was also based upon principles of nonviolence and civil disobedience. The SCLC organized various marches and fought for various social and racial causes in the South. One of the causes that the SCLC focused on was getting blacks the right to vote. Although the 15th Amendment granted racial equality in regards to voting, there were some states that required black voters to pass literacy tests. These tests were designed in a way that black people often failed them. The SCLC organized what they called citizenship schools, a program where SCLC teachers would teach blacks to make it easier for them to pass literacy tests. The SCLC also participated in the Albany Movement, a movement in 1961 and 1962 in Albany, Georgia to end segregation. Unfortunately, these protests were relatively unsuccessful due to the lack of media coverage. It wasn't until the Birmingham campaign that the SCLC got national recognition. In Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963, the SCLC organized a major demonstration to bring attention to the mistreatment of blacks in American society. The SCLC specifically called for the end of segregation in public facilities, restaurants, and stores in Birmingham. When business owners refused to cooperate, the SCLC staged a series of sit-ins and nonviolent protests. These protests provoked mass arrests and lots of media attention. With many of the protesters in jail, the SCLC relied on the children of the protesters to continue the cause. The sheriff of Birmingham, Bull Connor, authorized the use of high-pressure hoses on the protesters. The general outrage over the actions of Bull Connor and the Birmingham police and fire departments prompted the White House to take action and force Birmingham to change its laws. After the success at Birmingham, the SCLC called for a massive march on Washington to bring attention to the issue of racial equality. In Washington, King and other SCLC leaders met with groups such as the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Congress of Racial Equality. In Washington, 200 to 300,000 demonstrators listened as King made his famous I Have a Dream speech, in which he articulated the goals of the civil rights movement. The March on Washington also received huge national coverage, bringing the issue of racial equality to the eyes of America. Following the March on Washington, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act made Jim Crow laws, and any other laws that were based upon separate but equal philosophy, illegal. President Kennedy supported the bill, expressing his support for desegregation of public facilities and businesses. The civil rights movement had come far, but they were still fighting for equality in the South. One of the main focuses of the SCLC was the Selma voting rights campaign and the eventual march to Montgomery. In Selma, Alabama, protesters gathered to demonstrate, calling for voting reform. The police of Selma responded to the nonviolent protesters with violence. Police officers used clubs and tear gas to push back the protesters. Together, the SCLC and SNCC organized a march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the violence in Selma and to call upon Americans to take action to end segregation. As the marches continued, public support of the civil rights movement grew. The images of policemen sending dogs to maul protesters and using tear gas against nonviolent individuals helped further the causes of the SCLC and SNCC. The prolonged protests of these groups eventually prompted President Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act, which made any kind of racist voting practices illegal. In a sense, it solidified the 15th Amendment. The SCLC continued under the leadership of King. This sadly changed, however, in 1968 when King was assassinated during a trip to Memphis, Tennessee. King was shot and killed by a racist white Southerner named James Earl Ray. Although the SCLC, SNCC, and the NAACP were the major groups involved in the civil rights movement, there were also some individuals whose actions were pivotal in the campaign for racial equality. Individuals such as Malcolm X preached about the mistreatment of blacks in America. Malcolm X in particular was known for being very critical of the United States in his speeches. Another blow came to the civil rights movement in 1968. Robert Kennedy, a senator from New York and a likely contestant for the presidency, was shot and killed while campaigning in Los Angeles. Kennedy had been a huge supporter of desegregation and racial equality. He had worked with black leaders like King to push for racial change in the past. During the 1970s, some civil rights groups began to move away from the nonviolence that had previously been preached by King. Groups like the Black Panther Party, which had branched off from SNCC, adopted militaristic philosophies. These groups put a tarnish on the nonviolence that had defined the civil rights movement in the past. Despite the deaths of major leaders such as King and Kennedy, the civil rights movement was able to continue to fight for racial justice. Today, the NAACP and similar groups are still strong in their fight for social and racial equality. It is because of the actions of these individuals that the United States is as free for all citizens as it is today.